Hello everyone, my name is Tony Morgan, I'm Editor-in-Chief of SC Media UK. Welcome to today's webinar, We Can't Hold on a Sec, Why We Need DevSecOps from Day One. A DevSecOps culture is a must to maintain speed, agility and innovation, while simultaneously meeting regulations and staying ahead of attacks. This webinar will show you how to bake it into your technology's DNA from day one. DevSecOps means everyone is responsible for security and compliance from day one. Ultimately, the challenge is to deal with imminent cloud-based attacks whilst having visibility into processes to safeguard user and corporate information. This is easiest and most scalable under the mantra of DevSecOps, do it from day one and you won't regret it on day 1000. To explain and provide deeper insight into how and why you should do this, we have George Gerchow, VP of Security and Compliance at Sumo Logic. As Sumo Logic's VP of Security and Compliance, George brings 18 years of information technology and systems management expertise to the application of IT processes and disciplines. His expertise impacts the security, compliance, and operational status of complex, heterogeneous, virtual, and cloud computing environments. George's practical experience and insight from managing the infrastructures of some of the world's largest corporate and government institutions makes him an expert in virtualization, ITSM, ITIL, configuration management, cloud secure architecture design, operational security, and compliance. He holds CISP, ITIL, Cisco, and Microsoft certifications. Gerchow is also the co-author of the CIS Quick Start Cloud Infrastructure Benchmark version 1.00. George is also a faculty member for IANS, Institute of Applied Network Security. In this session, George will share best practice of how companies have achieved implementing a DevSecOps culture, as well as the benefits they've realized and potential catastrophes they've avoided. Some of the key takeaways will include how DevSecOps is changing how organizations approach security and compliance, a practitioner's guide to securing the cloud and demystifying GDPR, and how to successfully implement and maintain a DevSecOps culture. We'll have Q&As following George's presentation, and you're welcome to ask questions via the interface at any time. Welcome, George. We're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I cannot tell you how excited I am to be here today. This is a subject that's obviously near and dear to my heart, so I appreciate the warm intro, and let's get down to it. So the topics we're going to cover, one is security as code, and so we believe at Sumo Logic, and I happen to believe that coding is where it all starts and ends. Developers lead the way as far as innovation and technology. They're the ones that are constantly disrupting. When you think about things like cloud computing and virtualization in general, a lot of that was driven by developers who just weren't getting systems fast enough to be able to code and deliver new products and features back to their end user base. And so if we can start baking in security into the development lifecycle, it really helps drive this concept of continuous security. So it all starts with developers. As you mentioned, it's a community, but we really have to start with the developers. The next piece is what's DevSecOps. I mean, what does it really mean? It's a big buzzword out there. It's just going to get bigger in 2018, so we'll take a look and see what that means. And then we'll go through 6 practical steps to improve your security DNA. So 6 things that we do, constantly trying to improve. Next year it could be 7. We could slim it down to 5. But over the course of 7 years, being native born in AWS and a company that builds modern day applications, we have 6 steps that we follow to really create this DevSecOps process. And then we'll do a quick demo on compliance and threat investigation in AWS services. As I mentioned, we're native born to AWS and a highly regulated company. Then we'll talk about some key takeaways before we get into the Q&A. So what is driving the DevSecOps movement in general? So if you start thinking about the way that we looked at applications in the past, there were 3-tiered applications. That's really the way we secured things. They were bound by operating systems. They were bound by data centers. They were not portable. And then we had these things, that impacted the market like virtualization. And then eventually we started moving to more things like containers, Docker, Kubernetes, and the continuous improvement and continuous delivery supply chain. And so now we're taking a look at modern applications which are assembled with a multitude of APIs and microservices. And so to be able to really secure these applications and get away from these monolithical waterfall type methodologies, we've moved more into agile development and scrums and releasing code in small chunks. So that's really what's driving this movement, is to get code out quicker but more secure from day one. Cloud adoption is definitely key to all this, because now all of a sudden we have developers that are going around IT, moving straight out to the cloud, lines of business moving out to the cloud because of speed. And so if we're not in the security space, if we are not part of that process but allowing it to remain agile, we will get left behind. We will get circumvented, and then eventually everyone loses because there will probably be a breach. And so we'll talk in depth about that a little bit more in the presentation, but it's the reality of where we're at. Cloud adoption is driving a lot of this. And then finally, as was mentioned up front, it's a collaboration. It takes a neighborhood. It can't just be one siloed department that sits on an ivory tower to do security, So it's up to security to raise that level of awareness, get everyone involved, do some best practices to make sure that everyone understands their roles and responsibilities. But in the meantime, it's collaboration across the board, starting with development all the way down to the end user, all the way down to the admin that greets people at their desk. It's across the board. And so it definitely takes collaboration, and it takes a neighborhood to be able to do so. So what is DevSecOps? It's really funny because when the term DevOps first came out, a really good friend of mine, Davi Ottenheimer, who's a security guru in his own respect, said, "You're just taking operations out of the picture." And then DevSecOps came out, and I called him up one day, and I said, "Well, are we taking security out of the picture too?" And it's a joke, but in reality, it's not. What we mean by DevSecOps is that we're combining these things. We're starting to bring together these three disparate and siloed functions to start working through a agile process to deliver code and deliver services in a secure fashion. So up front, from the planning stage, security and operations are involved with development, to understand what are going to be the requirements, what kind of infrastructure is going to be needed. Is it going to be in the cloud? Is it going to be on-prem? Is it going to be hybrid? Is it going to be virtual? What kind of security metrics need to be taken? So do we need to do constant vulnerability scans? Is it going to touch mission-critical data? Is it going to affect critical data? All the way through the coding phase, so planning up front, and then even during the coding phase, we're going to do vulnerability checks while the code is being written. And then eventually, while it's being built and tested, we continue these best practices as well, too, to make sure that we're putting analytics and testing all the way through the QA process. And then once it's released out into the wild, it doesn't stop, because then we have to log and do event monitoring and configuration changing and patching and user privileges and identity and access management, and continue to do vulnerability assessments. And then so that life cycle, from release to deployment to operational standards, it just continues to go on and on within the environment, but we're all working together, all hands on deck, to make sure that this takes place, again, in an agile fashion. So before, what would happen, just to give you a description, security would kind of sit on the outside. So, developers would get together, they plan a software development lifecycle, the SDLC, what they were going to do, and then they would code, and they would build it, test it, release it. And when it was released, the operations guys would be like, "Oh, wow, well, we got to deploy this across multiple systems out there." They would deploy it. And then at the very end, someone would say, "Hey, security guys, by the way, we're deploying this code into the environment. Can you guys make sure it's locked down?" So, of course, there'd be vulnerability checks, and you'd find all kinds of vulnerabilities and possible threats within the code, but by then it's too late. The train is moving, and it's moving at a rapid pace. So at that point, it's way too late. You're trying to bolt on security. If you patch something and it breaks, and then you're stopping productivity, And then all of a sudden you end up in this position where you're bolting on security and not baking it in. And by the way, the operational people have the same problem because they're like, how are we supposed to deploy this in scale when we didn't understand what the overall mission or goal was up front? And so baking these things in is absolutely mission critical from day one. As I walked you through sort of that release cycle and the automation of security within the DevOps workflow, you can start seeing the advantages of working together from the very beginning. And by the way, the developers have to already, and operational people already have to have security in mind. So you had to have planted that seed. It's not like there's just a security person sitting in the room directing or orchestrating this from the beginning. It's everyone kind of working together to understand mutually what the outcome is going to be, what the goal is going to be, and what the risks are. So security in the DNA, as I mentioned up front, it absolutely 150% starts with engineering. If you have engineers out there that are just releasing code into the wild that's not secure, in today's day and age with digital transformation, you have huge problems. Now let me describe it this way. In the past, we could get away with some of this because we had a hard shell, soft center, perimeter security type approach. And so for the most part, anything that was within that hard shell, we could sort of protect. So it was okay if we had some vulnerabilities in the code, and not acceptable, but it was just kind of the norm because we had that hard shell and we were protecting things at the perimeter. Well, things have changed. There is no perimeter anymore. With workloads in AWS, GCP, Azure, containerization and portability, like I mentioned before, code is everywhere. So you have to assume from day one that you're releasing code into a hostile environment. And if it's being released into a hostile environment, you cannot afford to have major security vulnerabilities, or else you're gonna open yourself up to risk, eventually a threat, and then eventually you're gonna get hacked. And once you lose that kind of reputation and start losing customer data in today's day and age, it's over for you. And so you have to assume that from day one you're releasing code into a hostile environment. So encouraging that good security hygiene and engineering, it really starts with training, which we'll go through in our DNA lifecycle. And then you got to just continue this process. So people always talk about continuous assessments, continuous compliance. This is critical, because as you're writing this code and making changes, you're also gathering evidence for compliance. And then real time is a big thing too. As fast as things are moving, our company, for example, can do anywhere from 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 releases in a day. Companies like Etsy are doing 40 to 80 releases in a day. That's the ultimate goal. And so when you're releasing that much code to your customers, and especially in multi-tenant type environments, everything has to be real time. You cannot afford a 24-hour delay. You cannot afford an hour-long delay. It has to be real-time alerting across threats. And then enabling developers to drive iterative security changes and innovation in general. So forget security for a second. You want them to innovate. So you want developers to have the capacity and capability to suggest and make changes and add new products and features on demand, in a controlled fashion, but on demand. So the 6 steps, and this is something that we absolutely live by at Sumo Logic. Again, even if you take one and incorporate it now, which we'll talk about importance, or if you take 3 of them or 6, or you add on one that's better for your organization, it gives you a good foundation, because usually what happens when people start talking DevSecOps is they try to tell you what it means, and they argue about what it means, but nobody really comes back and says, this is how you do it. So this is how you do it part. So the 6 steps that we use is, number 1, code analysis, to make sure, again, that we're way up front in the software development lifecycle. 2, change management, so being able to understand the impact of changes to the organization and to how to speed this process up, which we'll go into in detail here in a second. 3, as I'm doing this, gathering evidence for compliance. 4, threat investigation. So the changes we just made to the environment, did it open up any new threats or vulnerabilities? 5, vulnerability management. So did we capture all the vulnerabilities up front? Were there any new ones that now we have because of the release that we just did, and how can we get better moving forward? And then 6, which is my all-time favorite, which is security training, and especially focused on developers. So let's go ahead and break down all 6 individually. So the first one is embedding code into the analysis of your release. So this is, again, when we start talking about the continuous improvement, continuous development pipeline. And these are brand new tools out there, so people are always like, what makes this so different? Well, in any organization, you can have a combination of Artifactory, JFrog, Jenkins, I mentioned before, Kubernetes, Docker, Mesosphere, a plethora of new tools that developers are using. And by the way, they change, right? A developer is going to go from one tool to the next if it's going to make his job more productive and bring more agility to it. So embedding yourself into this process, into this pipeline is important because you got to understand what kind of tools they're using. Are those tools themselves secure? Are they building this code in a secure fashion? And then also the release of small chunks. And this is a big thing. If I'm have 2 releases a year, that probably means that I have massive amounts of lines of code to check. That's just not scalable, and it's not feasible that you're going to catch vulnerabilities that way, especially in an automated fashion. If I'm releasing code in small chunks, that gives me an advantage in multiple ways. One, I'm releasing code in small chunks, so I'm getting things done and more releases out there. But 2, from a security and compliance perspective, I'm able to review that code very, very quickly and, again, make sure that I don't disrupt the process, but able to catch things up front. And so that release in small batches is totally critical. And then also, being able to do analysis in the Q&A process. So we did it, during the planning stage, coding phase, but we have to do it during the testing phase as well, too, and quality assurance to make sure that nothing slipped through the cracks. Change management, my all-time favorite, so change management was actually created to absorb a higher rate of change with less impact to the business, and the complete opposite happened. What happened was we slowed everything way down with change advisory boards that meet once a week and go through major and standard and minor changes, and we sit around and pontificate about what we think is going to happen once we make this change. And the funniest part is back-out plans, which is I'm going to undo what I did pretty much, but we all know it doesn't work that way. And so the modern way to do change management is any developer at any given time should be able to suggest a change. And then you can empower the process by using modern-day tools like Slack and Jira, have maybe 3 to 5 people review those changes very quickly and approve or disapprove, tests right into an environment. If you're using cloud, again, this is one of the advantages of cloud, is you can actually have staging environments that look exactly like your production environment, do a quick test, analysis, and then roll it out into the wild. So one of the things that we do is any change, any mission-critical security change gets rolled out in 24 hours. No ifs, ands, or buts. It just happens. And that's way different. Stop and think about patch management in most organizations, or even maybe where you're at today. Right? I came from VMware, where I ran their internal compliance practice on security, and it took us forever to patch systems. We were proud of ourselves when we patched systems in a month. So here we're talking 24 hours. So again, being able to leverage agility with the process itself to make sure that any vulnerabilities we found, we actually accounted for, and then get that code out in a very quick and agile fashion. Compliance monitoring, and here's a philosophical discussion. Compliance must be embedded and connected to security. Security people have a hard time with this. Compliance, it's just another checkbox. It doesn't make me secure. Well, guess what? It pays for your security budget, number one. Number 2 is as you're securing code, as you're going through this review process, as you're making changes, if you gather evidence for compliance while those new updates are taking place, and then you're in the state of continuous compliance, continuous audit. So when an auditor comes in for an ISO 27001, or even as we're going down the path of becoming GDPR ready, that's when you start gathering this evidence, is right here through this process. So then that way you don't have to go back all the way to stage 1 and what did we do in code analysis, and disrupting the time of the developer to ask them questions that you should already know the answer to. So compliance monitoring is critical. And at the same time, making sure that everything is being audited during this process, and then monitoring all of your systems for any potential bad behavior. So again, a very key component that's not going to slow things down if you do it up front and bake it in. Threat investigations. And so again, this is now where we start looking to identify if there's been any compromises once we've made these changes and put it out into production. So the real-time alerting I was talking about is critical. Sometimes you never know until you make a change into a production environment and say, oh, wow, there's one that was missed. It's not often that happens, but you must do threat investigation at this point, And so being able to develop playbooks and scenarios for both IT and security to walk through what this is going to look like, and then leveraging things like threat intelligence and cloud computing is critical. And again, it has to be in real time. Look, we just released this out there. Guess what? Someone accidentally created a security group with 0.0.0.0 /any, that's public facing. I need to know that, so we want to be able to capture that very, very quickly within this process. And then vulnerability checks, so once we released the code out there, and yes, we did vulnerability checks while we released it in small chunks, understood the impact of the change, evidence gathered with compliance, and then look for potential threats, we still have to conduct scans once it's in production, as well as penetration tests. So penetration testing, it doesn't stop. This is one of those things where you've got to continually challenge yourself. Someone with rights or permissions may make a change that is unbecoming and opens you up to a vulnerability, or there may be a new exploit that was released after you did your code. So many things can happen in such a short amount of time that these continual vulnerability checks and penetration testing is completely critical to an environment. Now here we are, my fave, security training. And one of the things that we love to do is scare the death out of developers. And one of the ways to do that is you send them to actual, real, geeky coding security conferences like DEF CON. So DEF CON, the one that I'm referring to, is that week-long in Las Vegas. And, yes, I don't know why they do it in late July and August, because we're all burning up out there. So what it is you have Black Hat, which has turned into more of a marketing type, good awareness though. I'm not going to dog Black Hat. Really good awareness around security. Vendors get to display their stuff. Some pretty good talks there. Then you have B-Sides, which is kind of where I live. B-Sides is more the alternative, centralized hacking, more of a community. You can do pick locks and everything else there, kind of in the middle of the week, separate, not as fancy schmancy as Black Hat. But then you have DEF CON. DEF CON over the weekend is where the serious coding, unethical and ethical hackers are at. And so when you send developers to participate in these communities, at least one or two of them, a few things happen. So the first thing you should do, and we do this, by the way, is we have a deck that we share with those developers because it's a privilege to go. That says, this is what you wear, this is where you stay, and do not ever bring your phone into DEF CON or else you may be on the wall of shame. The wall of shame is people who actually get hacked on their mobile devices while they're walking through DEF CON. And so these developers first go in with the mindset of, okay, I'm walking into something serious here. Then they actually get to see their peers, people who are just as good at coding as them or better. And we're in the Valley, in Silicon Valley, so we obviously have some very talented people, but there's some super talented people at DEF CON, and their whole focus is hacking your code. And so they get to see this happen in real time and live, and it really changes their mentality. So you have them come back to your organization, do a lunch and learn, tell everyone what they learned within the organization, and it just stretches for miles of credibility and awareness and gets everyone involved. The other things that you can do here, too, is if a developer happens to make a mistake, so let's say putting credentials into a collaboration program like Slack, but it's encrypted, you still have to, tell them those are still credentials, even though they're encrypted, so you make them rotate their credentials across the entire environment. Sometimes, depending on the level of trust with the developer, that can take up to 2 days. And then you have them do a lunch and learn on that, what it was they did, where they had to rotate their credentials, and then how much time it took to fix it. And then it gets everyone thinking about awareness, because mistakes are going to happen, and we welcome mistakes. What we don't welcome is multiple mistakes of the same kind. But everyone's going to make mistakes, and it's a collaborative environment. And again, it takes a community, but security training, I just can't talk enough about the awareness and how much you can do here if you do it properly. So again, kind of reviewing what we talked about, it's also interconnected, So if you start up front with the code analysis and really start understanding what's happening from the very beginning, from the inception, you can now start making the proper changes in a rapid fashion with hopefully, less cause and effect to production and outages and security while you're making those changes. And then gather your evidence for compliance while you've made these changes and up front and they're still fresh, so you don't have to go back and reinvent the wheel. Do your threat investigation on what actually just took place and start looking for improvements. check for vulnerabilities, do penetration testing while your code is out in the wild, again, for constant improvement. And then finally, security training, and not only for developers but across the organization, but it's just very, very key to follow some steps like this. And again, if it was me and someone said, George, where would you start? Well, I'd start with number one, code analysis. If I didn't do anything else on this chart, I'd start with number one. I'd probably combine number one and number six, if I was starting from scratch. But every organization is different. And again, we're very highly regulated, one of the most highly regulated organizations, I believe, on the planet. And so, we have to have these 6 steps. But again, we're constantly improving and looking at it. So hopefully this gave you a basis of somewhere to start with your DevSecOps process and baking security into your DNA, which is really what it's all about. So now let's take a look at, well, what does that mean? So how does this work in production? So we have a zero trust model, so defense in depth approach, which again, zero trust has been around for a long time. Everyone's talked about it. How do you really start preventing things from happening in your environment, like east-west type movement and lateral movement and all those things? And so we did ours all based on the following principles. So we ensure that all resources are accessed securely regardless of the location. So what you're looking at is pretty much our environment at a very high level and how we secure it. So the Internet of Things coming in through our elastic load balancers, all traffic, traveling encrypted at TLS 1.2, going through our bastion hosts. Our customers come in right through the receiver side. That's where they do their key exchange, and we use what's called key encryption key, or KEK. This is a very key point, because some of the things that we didn't talk about is how highly regulated we are, as far as details and which regulations, but this is a PCI requirement, is to encrypt all data, but then also key management, and we rotate our keys every 24 hours. So if you're ever, talking to a vendor and they're out there in the cloud and they say they encrypt your data, ask them how often they rotate the keys. Okay, that's going to tell you a lot. If you have to open up a ticket or wait 6 months, you're talking to the wrong vendor. If they rotate them every 24 hours, it's someone who's highly, highly secure. So the way it works for us is, you hit that receiver, you get 2 keys. You get one for raw data, one for metadata. Once you get those 2 keys rotate every 24 hours. So at the end of the year, you end up with 730 unique keys on your key ring. If you go to the far right, that's our S3 bucket, and that vault that manages those keys is stored there. Then those keys are re-encrypted with KEK on KEK, so key encryption key on top of key encryption key. And so that whole process, again, very, very critical to keeping an environment secure. And think about the changes and the way that works. So now all of a sudden, if I'm highly secure, I have to make sure that any changes are not going to affect my environment. And then I have to have this DevSecOps approach to make sure that I'm very, very agile when it comes to coming into our environment or making any changes. So in order to connect to any production host, so again, look at the bottom right there where it says VPN, all of our operations personnel needs to VPN to our production environment, and they are using SSH keys, so 0 passwords. They are allowed to SSH from a bastion host called Box. Box is a bastion host that logs absolutely everything our operations personnel does. From there, they can SSH to individual boxes if they need to, or they can use a set of command line tools that we have developed to be able to call deploy shell to manage the deployment at a macro level of upgrading packages of our software from one version to another. So again, very, very highly regulated, lots of controls, lots of visibility, so we're micromanaging at this point, but at the same time, this is where we're working very closely with development and baking security in from day one. And then our customer support personnel follows the same procedure, but they log into a bastion server called Hop, and this provides them with very limited access where they can only make changes to our configuration database. This would be used, for example, if your company undergoes a merger and you need to change the name of your company that shows up when you log in. Well, that's something that our customer service engineers would do. So very, very secure. As you can see on the top, we're logging everything with our product. So again, this is Sumo Logic. We're a security analytics, big data analytics tool. We leverage IDS, so intrusion detection systems, and file integrity monitoring across every single host. So again, different concept. When you're on-prem, you do things more inline-based firewall type approach. We do everything on the host. We log everything with Sumo Logic. We leverage some of the great security services that AWS, Amazon provides, VPC flow logs, for example, CloudTrail, and then we bring in threat intelligence feeds natively to our environment, but not only to our environment, but also to 1,600 customers. So this is the advantage of multi-tenancy and something that we need to talk about. If we make one upgrade, everyone gets that upgrade. If we do a security push, everyone gets that security push. So it's not like we're doing this tenant by tenant or like in an on-prem environment where you're rolling this out slowly across BUs. This is everyone gets it at the same time. And so that threat intelligence feed is big because not only do we use it, but every single one of our 1,600 customers use it as well too. So it's amazing how the back end can also affect the front end. So let's take a look and see like how some of this works. So again, this is our native product, Sumo Logic, and this is how we use it internally, but a lot of our customers use it externally as well too. So we can see in this scenario, we're bringing in data from CloudTrail, which I mentioned before, which is going to tell me API type changes, changes that take place to ACLs, who made those changes, which is extremely valuable in real time. And then I'm also bringing in VPC flow logs, which VPC flow logs look at it as NetFlow. So this is NetFlow for AWS, and what I'm looking for is like blacklisted IPs coming into VPC flow logs. That's going to be critical to me. And then also Elastic Load Balancers, which is on the right there, which is ELB. And I want to start seeing, again, if domains are coming through, blacklisted domains are coming through. And then on the bottom, you can start seeing our threat outliers. So this is all of our threat feeds coming into Sumo Logic. Again, our customers get the same thing, all you can eat for free. And we're doing some machine learning here. So all the grayed out area, this is what we expect to see as far as outliers and changes made to the environment. And then when something spikes up outside of that gray area, that's an anomaly. So this is all, we're not putting anything in here. It's just algorithms running to see what the norm is. So we found an incident up top with VPC flow logs on a blacklisted IP. Once we started gathering all of that data with those blacklisted IPs, and then we're able to go back, do some automated threat response, threat detection back into the environment. And so one of the big questions people always ask is, how does this really affect your compliance posture? So let's talk about compliance for a second. So our environment, again, is 6,000, anywhere from 6,000, 7,000 servers in AWS, all very highly regulated, as you saw the slide that I had on earlier. PCI DSS, 3.2, so that's a big deal for us. This is our third year in a row doing that. Again, hard to achieve those things unless you bake security and compliance into the process like we talked about before with our 6 steps. ISO 27001, CSA star. And so the value of those 2 certifications, one, ISO 27001 shows that we put a lot of rigor around our policies and procedures and looking for constant improvement as we move forward in time over those processes and policies and procedures. What I'll say about ISO 27001 that's very key, this is our 3rd year in a row getting it, it's easy to get. Not easy, but easy. And the reason why I say it's easy is because you're pretty much showing people your policies and procedures from scratch and saying, this is what I plan on doing moving forward. As we all know, when it comes to saying what you're going to do, it's all about doing what you said you were going to do. So did you really do it? And that's when the 2nd year becomes so important, because they then come in with a microscope and make sure that your policies and procedures then show exactly what you said you were going to do when it comes to your, improvement over time. And then you got to share any nonconformities or things that you didn't do. And if you have a major nonconformity, it means that you most likely will not have your certification. So, having it 3 years in a row shows substantial growth and progress and differentiation in the space. A CSA star, again, that's where you add another set of domains and controls on top of ISO 27001, which is a prerequisite. So this is more for cloud-based companies, but we want to take it to the next level. We just passed our 3rd. We're hoping for CSA star gold, which we've gotten silver 2 years in a row, but gold would be a good thing to show improvement. And then things like HIPAA in the United States, to be able to show protection of healthcare information and personal information. And so to make, fits healthcare and the medical departments pretty well to show that information is protected over time. So we make sure we're attestated or audited against HIPAA every single year. And then now we get to the beauty of things, to the hot topic of the day, GDPR. So let's talk a bit about GDPR, and I'll explain what you're looking at here on the screen for a second, and I wanted to give you some time to read it as well too. But when it comes to GDPR, it's been really difficult for people to come out and say they're GDPR compliant. And the reason why is several. Well, one, the regulators themselves, so the people who can actually come in and validate this, because there is no big certificate that you hang on your wall saying I'm GDPR compliant. It's more about, the EU being able to make sure that you have privacy of data, and if you say you're GDPR compliant and all of a sudden they come in and do an audit, well, we've seen what's going to happen, up to 4% of your company gone, 20, X million dollars or $1 billion in fines, it just goes on and on and on. And we don't even know what that's going to look like yet, because I guarantee you that's going to probably change as well too. And so it's a matter of being ready for GDPR. Because a lot of, again, the external companies who can come in and help validate, they're still learning too. They're learning right now. They're trying to figure out, how to best position your company and what to look for come May 25th of 2018, which is sort of the GDPR date. But there are some things you can do, to prepare for that. So the number one thing that you can do is establish a privacy program. And again, when we went through our 6 steps, that compliance monitoring is key. So that was the third step we had. I have to bake that in because I got to be ready for things like GDPR. Well, establishing a privacy program is definitely something an organization can do now or improve upon their privacy program to start doing things like data classification, data workflow, and how does that data flow through the environment, encryption. We talked about encryption before, right, with PCI, the rotation of keys every 24 hours. So we feel like we have a good leg up, in that area. So improving our privacy program, leveraging some of the things we currently have with encryption and things like that to make sure that we're prepared and getting GDPR ready. The other thing you can do is establish a data privacy or data protection officer. It's funny, in Europe they call them data protection officers. In the United States we call them data privacy officers. Either way, it's a DPO. And so having a DPO on staff is critical, and getting them the proper training and certifications that they need, so we've gone out and taken that measure. Another thing you can do as well, too, is make sure you have a privacy lawyer or attorney on staff. So we have one that works very closely to our team. Reporting structure is a big thing, so that legal counsel has to have direct communication, if not report right to the CISO. And so that's what we have. Our team has an attorney, on retainer that communicates with me, all the time about GDPR, because it's definitely something that we're focusing on quite heavily. So that's another step that you can take to make sure you have that. Another thing you can do, and this is where we get to what you're looking at, is use these tools. Okay, so there's these tools out there called CASBs, which are Cloud Access Security Brokerage tools. And the vein of their existence started off with shadow IT, with people going out to the cloud. That was the vein of their existence, and then people would look and go, oh my gosh, look how many people are going to Box. Wow, look how many people are going around our environment, like what we talked about up front, right? If you're a blocker for security, people are going to go to where they can be the most productive, because when people go to the cloud, they're not being malicious. They're trying to become more productive. The question you should always ask is why? Why are they going around IT? What is it that we're not doing? Security, why are they going around security? Are we putting so much process in place that we are not letting these people become productive? And so this is how these tools got started, the CASB tools with Shadow IT. But they also did 2 other cool things. One was firewall off services. So that would be like if we decided to use Box over Dropbox, they would allow you to shut off Dropbox. But the third thing they did is critical, okay, and you can leverage this today. The third thing is they do an evaluation of cloud providers, like us. I mean, we're a cloud provider. We're, a big data analytics, security analytics shop that services over 1,600 customers in AWS. And so they'll run these great executive-level risk reports and score these providers. So Netscope in general uses something called the CCI, or the Cloud Controls Index, to be able to rate these cloud-based providers. And they rate them on how they do encryption and what kind of certifications and attestations they have, and how they do encryption at rest, and how they log and monitor everything within the environment. So very, very detailed. And if you take a look at one of these tools, and again, this is Netscope, who happens to be, not only who we use, but also a lot of other customers use, but there's other players in the space, Sky High, CloudLock, and several others. But this Netscope report, to me, was interesting because they had just released this great article, if you haven't seen it yet, which talks about how somewhat of like 90% of all companies today are not GDPR ready. So they believe that based upon privacy laws, regulations, some of the work that they've done that I talked about before, establishing a DPO, privacy program, things like DLP within the environment, encryption, that they believe that almost 90%, if not most, cloud companies are not ready for GDPR. And so, we take this very seriously. And, they measure everyone. Like if you go in and you start doing a search against, people you're doing business with today or people you want to evaluate, you will see them on the list. So this happens to be my company. So this is Sumo Logic. And what you're seeing up on the top left-hand side with that red arrow is a score of 86. So it's 86 out of 100, which is a very high score. It's within the top 10 of, I don't know, maybe like 5,000 cloud providers. And so very, very high score. So we're proud of that, constantly improving. We want that to be 100. Trust me, I don't like getting an 86 on anything. I'm very competitive, and so is my team. But we'll take it for now. If you go straight down from there, highlighted in yellow, you see PCI DSS. Wanted to make sure we pointed this out because of the way we do encryption and rotate those keys, again, every 24 hours, and the way we do evidence gathering through our 6-step process, this is a big deal for us. And this naturally put us in good position when it came to our GDPR score by Netscope. So if you go over to the bottom right, and I have that big old red arrow pointing down at a high, and then highlighted in yellow, you see GDPR readiness. Well, we scored a high. And so that it sets a level of comfort that here's this third-party tool, independent, out there on their own, rating providers across the board, and we ended up scoring a high. And so we're very proud of that, and we believe that 6-step process and the way we do security got us to that point. And so, again, these tools are great. Use them internally. If you have a chance and you want to look at your own company or you want to evaluate another vendor out there in the cloud, this is a great way to do it, is leveraging, again, a CASB tool, Cloud Access Security Brokerage type tool. Okay, so key takeaways. So the number one key takeaway is put Bolton Security on. Get yourself into that software development lifecycle. Understand what the continuous improvement, continuous development supply chain looks like, what those new tools are, and getting security baked in across the entire company. So, do security training with developers, do security training with the people on staff. Like, we didn't talk about this part, but we do phishing attacks all the time to ourselves, so we'll pick 75 random lucky people, and at any given time, we will send them a phishing email, and it's pretty amazing who clicks on those links. Like, the numbers have reduced over time. We don't announce it. We don't even announce a lot of the results externally, or not even externally, but outside of our team, because we want that continuous improvement, and we want people to talk about it internally to each other. But again, people can make mistakes and learn from them, but if you do it twice, and then there's another problem there. So, baking security into the DNA of your entire company is just the biggest takeaway from all this. Streamlining these archaic processes to remain agile. Again, I talked about change management before, and I think that's a key one. And just to give you an idea, I came from finance and government contracting in the background, where I developed a bunch of networks in the government space, worked at VMware, like I talked about before, for many years. Our change management processes were long, rigorous, and archaic. So you would have someone like myself that would go to, like, my boss, Katie, and I'd say, hey, listen, I want to patch 1,000 machines. I want to patch them Thursday night. Can you go to the CAB or the change advisory board with me, or change control board, which are also called CCB. There's about 50,000 different names for these things. And, Katie would be like, cool, looks like they're good changes. Let's go to that, to the CAB. We'd get in front of the CAB. People would look at old Visio diagrams, look at the backup plan, which I talked about before, is just a rollback. Just very, very archaic way of looking at things, not understanding the impact. talk about the rollout, which is going to be on a Thursday night, but we'll probably maybe miss 80% of those machines. We won't even look to see if any extra changes actually took place because we're not monitoring anything. Just slow moving, and measured on the wrong thing, not even measuring out just the business. This is something that has to change. Change management has to change because you need to make these processes way agile to be able to deliver a high rate of change with the least amount of impact to the business. So like I talked about before, anyone in our organization, anybody can raise their hand and make a change, and then we have an SLA for critical security changes 24 hours. It's out there. Zero Trust cloud security model. I don't believe you can do Zero Trust on-prem. I think it's extremely difficult. I think the only way to do that is unplugged network cable, so UPnC. It's extremely difficult because of the nature of the way that we bolt security on in a data center. So a data center is like a big server. I have compute, network, and storage all in one. And then what do? I bolt on a firewall. I bolt on an IDS or intrusion detection system. And they're spamming ports now, so I'm aggregating all of that traffic through a single port, getting limited visibility. Because, by the way, I can only do scans in non-production hours. How ridiculous is that? When I want to do scans, it should be production hours because I want to see what's really happening at the height of our business. And so Zero Trust is hard to do unless you clean the slate and you start somewhere like in a cloud-type environment like I demonstrated earlier, really being able to limit the movement and monitoring what people are doing in a development environment. And then finally, threat intelligence in the cloud. Like we talked about before, being able to take those threat feeds, measure them across the environment, understand who the bad actors are and the high level of threats. And so, before we established threat intelligence in our cloud, we would get a bad blacklisted IP that would come in. And again, with cloud computing, what's your IP today could be my IP tomorrow and vice versa. My team would stop and focus on that blacklisted IP, and 9 times out of 10, 99 out of 100, it would be someone else's IP who's totally legit. But we wasted all that time and effort chasing that down. And now what happens is we immediately can say, whoop, blacklisted IP came in through VPC flow logs. Again, that's giving me port protocol, source destination IP, packets dropped, packets received. I can now say, is it a high-level risk of a threat by these threat feeds that we get, and who's the bad actor, and then start a threat response program to see if it's real or not, and only focus on those high level of threats that are associated to a known bad actor. So that kind of closes the loop when it comes to a lot of our security best practices while we're building modern-day applications in this whole era of digital transformation. So with that, we will open it up to questions. But just on my final thoughts, so it really does, as was stated up front so eloquently, it takes a community, so this kind of awareness, talking through these things, understanding what direction the company is going in, understanding just the nature of your business, so as a security person, what is the nature of your business? What is it that you're trying to accomplish on a daily basis? Is it banking transactions? Is it building cars? Is it how airplanes take off and servicing those customers? And then understanding your role in security and how it fits into that company, and then expanding that into minions out there across your entire company to make sure that everyone's thinking the same way about the business and how to make it highly secure. So with that, we'll open up to questions.
Thanks very much, Georgia. A really comprehensive and very practical presentation. We can now take questions from our audience. I think everybody's accepting the need for DevSecOps to make us secure. But you were talking about collaboration there and the fact that even DevSecOps itself is a combination. So whose job is it to champion DevSecOps? And not just champion it to get it going, but when it is underway, when it comes to enforcing operational and security hygiene, whose role is it to head up that enforcement?
What a great question. So we'd love to say that again is everyone's, but it's not. I believe that this falls directly on the CISO at first. It falls on the CISO, CSO, whoever the highest ranking security person is. It falls on them to get buy-in from their peers, which is the executive staff, CIO, again, very critical to that, CFO, who you should be locked at arms with, the CFO or Chief Financial Officer, CEO, and drive it through your executive staff, and then also all the way up to the board, So, but the champion, which is such a great question, the champion has to be the CISO or the CSO within the organization to put together a plan, a comprehensive strategy that shows how this is going to be accomplished and what the benefits will be back to the business, get executive and board buy-in, and then just drive it down.
Okay, George. I mean, the next one is that obviously this is all great if you're starting from a greenfield site, but that's not most of us. So you talked about moving away from the assembling of using existing components, but it's not going to be viable to build all applications from start. And similarly, mergers, and there's also our legacy systems. So actually starting from where we are, we've got systems in place, we're going to merge and we get somebody else's systems, and we also want to use components that we've built in the past. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, and another fantastic question, and this comes up quite often, when people ask me about it, because you're right, we started Greenfield in AWS, we had that advantage, but think about this, okay? Any organization, I don't care who you are, what vertical you're from, you can be from finance, you can be from government, it just doesn't matter. You have greenfield opportunities, and the boat was missed, by the way, with virtualization. So I can remember 10 years ago, 12 years ago, telling people in the security space and telling companies, listen, you need to start baking security best practices into your virtual infrastructure because that's where it's all going to go. And I cannot tell you how many times people looked at me and said, we will never, ever, ever virtualize mission-critical systems or house critical data in virtualized environments. What happened? Everyone virtualized everything. So now as people are moving to the cloud, that is a perfect greenfield opportunity. I have a workload. It's going to GCP. It's going to AWS. It's going to Azure. Let me start baking these concepts in now for those workloads because ultimately – people like me believe that that's where the majority of workloads are going to go, off-prem. Even do it with SaaS-based productivity apps like Office 365 or Workday, Salesforce, whatever it may be. Start thinking this way now and baking a lot of those things in now. And then what's going to happen, traversely, is you'll see it impacting what's happening on-prem. So even if you're in this hybrid mode or you're mostly on-prem, a lot of these best practices will start working their way back in because people say, look how efficient we are with these greenfield opportunities in the cloud. Where can we improve on-prem? And I'll tell you right now, the number one thing you can do on-prem, if you're in an on-prem or hybrid environment, is sit in the SDLC. Just sit in it. Even if you're not changing anything yet, from a security perspective, just sitting there and understanding the direction the company's moving in, understanding why certain applications are being built in certain ways, what tools are being used, and what products and features are going to be delivered to your customers, internal and external, that gives you a level of visibility and understanding that you won't get anywhere else. You won't get it in the CAP. You won't get it in change management. You'll get it in the SDLC or software development lifecycle.
Okay, now just jumping to change management, I mean, we were talking about, new threats, new vulnerabilities coming up, and your figure of, dealing with it within 24 hours as opposed to a month was very impressive. How do you actually achieve that? What were the main problems that you're going to have to overcome, and how do you overcome the problems?
The main problem that you're going to have to overcome is emotion. It's an emotional thing for people to stop doing things the way they always have. Whenever I bring this up, you should see the look on people's faces. The first thing they do is cross their arms, which is a bad sign, by the way. And it happens to me in dating all the time. People cross their arms. And when they cross their arms like that, it means that they've immediately pulled away because you've said something that could be taken as rather offensive. And the reality is it's emotion, because I'm an ITIL service, manager, like we talked about up front. People have always done it this way. And reality is it really effective? Is it really effective to do it that way? So the biggest hurdle to overcome is definitely emotion. The second one is technology. We've always used like these big, which big fan of Service Desk, okay, I love the folks ServiceNow, Sherwell, whatever, wherever you're at, you're all good. Your Service Desk provides a lot of value, but the way that it's been used is the problem. Is that You outline all these changes you want to make. You go ahead and hopefully create tickets for all these changes. These tickets then get reviewed. They go to the cab, which means once a week. It's just the whole process itself is built on slowness. And it's just not efficient. So if you can start leveraging things like your ticketing system, but with something that's more collaborative like Slack, to where everyone has visibility and those changes get noticed, or requests for changes get noticed much quicker with analysis much quicker, and then you can start streamlining that process. Now, look, you may never be down to 24 hours like us, because we're greenfield, like you mentioned, but you can narrow down the time. Why does the CAP have to meet once a week? Why do they have to meet at all? Why do I have to sit there and stare at these other 12 people who actually send a disciple from their own unit half the time anyway, because they're not going to show up to the meeting? Do it virtually. Use email if you have to in the beginning. Use something to where everyone can review a change very quickly, understand the real impact of that change, yay or nay, and then say why that change wasn't approved if you don't approve it. And then if it was approved, completely measure it, as it's going out the door. And so I think emotions is number one, and then 2, technology, and then 3, streamlining that process. I'd say those were probably the 3 biggest things around change management.
That's really great. I mean, you've gone part of the way to answering the next question, which was dealing with those colleagues who've got their arms folded. How do we go about achieving the high level of proficiency in security across our staff in a short period of time? I mean, not only in our own staff, and you did mention things like phishing attacks, doing phishing against your own staff, sending them to relevant conferences where they actually see, black hats. But what do we do also about our supply chain as well?
Yeah, and again, that's a really good question. I mean, across the board, I think the role of security leadership needs to change. There's always been this debate, and again, I've been around for 20 years or so in this space, and I've seen it time and time again. And people always talk about, the biggest risk to security is the fact that there's not enough security talent. And then when we talk about security talent, I'm always like, well, what does that mean? What do you mean? Is it technical aptitude? Is it business aptitude? What is it that you really mean by security? Is it awareness? Is it training? And my perspective on this has really started to change over the years, because I used to look at CISOs or, CSOs, chief security officers, in 2 different ways. Either one that was really highly technical, that just understood the nuts and bolts of security and could literally code to make security happen, jump and configure a firewall, whatever it took. And then there was the other one, which was kind of like the business leader, understood kind of how to bring a team together, strategy. And I think that those are both 2 relevant types of leadership. But I think that there's a third category that's starting to emerge, not just in security, but across all of IT in general. And that's someone who has more of evangelistic type skills as well. You've got to figure out a way how to get people to buy in. You've got to do it. And sometimes it's not just showing people how. It's not sitting down on a keyboard and demonstrating how that way. And sometimes it's not just outlining a strategy. You can outline the best strategy in the world, but if no one buys into it because you're not compelling enough, and then you're setting yourself up for failure. So I think that there has to be a third leg to that stool, which is you have to be able to sell and convince an organization from, again, I mean, the guy who is so valued, by the way. I mean, the guy who's out there attending to the security in the parking lot, physical security, which I value to no end, all the way to the CEO. So you have to have communication skills, and this needs to change across IT. The days of a Unix guy sitting behind their box with all the lights off looking like a vampire are over. That person also needs to be able to communicate and sell what's happening and the widgets that they're building. So I think that that's a piece that we just don't talk about enough, and that's how you do it. You have to find someone within your organization that can make it compelling and drive that strategy and drive that awareness across. And it can't be done in a monotone fashion. So I think in IT in general, just those communication skills and communication tactics and getting people to buy in, totally critical. Short videos, I'll tell you now, one of the things that we do short videos where we make fun of ourselves, so so-and-so got caught in a phishing attack. Maybe it's me, you know, or I walked away from my laptop and didn't leave the screen protector on. I use the same password for my personal Gmail as 4 or 5 business, you know, accounts. Or one time I took about 20 different applications we had, you know, within our environment that were critical, and then I wrote down fake passwords for them all and stuck them on my monitor and walked away and watched, you know, the reactions of all these people. And so you got to just think outside of the box and do these things to create momentum and create enthusiasm about what it is that you're trying to deliver to the organization.
George, that's been really great. I've got another question I was going to ask about regulation and actually compelling people, but I think we're actually running out of time. I'm sorry, that's going to have to be it for this session. So our thanks to George Gercho for sharing his insight and expertise today. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. This webcast will now be available on demand on the SC Media UK website, scmagazineuk.com, under the events tab. Thanks.